So today it's our great pleasure to have Alex Lipp speaking to giving the seminar today. So Alex got his undergraduate and master's degree from Queen's College and Cambridge. And currently he's still working on his PhD at the Imperial College London. And he mainly focuses on the sediments, but sometimes also on the sedimentary rocks, as he's going to talk about today. And so with that, I'll give the rest time to Alex. And normally our speakers speak for about 40 to 45 minutes and then leave another 15 to 20 minutes to interact with the audience. So with that, Alex, please.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be, well, virtually with you. So hopefully you'll enjoy what I'm going to present to you today. Oh, and just to say, if you can't hear me or the audio quality is not great, just give me a shout and I'll try and adjust that. Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting some work which I've been working on with my supervisors, Ollie Shortall and Gareth Roberts, and working alongside Eric Sperling and the Sedimentary Geochemistry and Paleo Environments Research Consortium, where we've been looking at how we can extract information of the weathering intensity and the composition of the continental crust, both at the modern day and then back in time, and how we can use that information to inform our understanding of geodynamics. Before I proceed, I should acknowledge that my funding comes from the UK government via the National Environment Research Council, and currently I'm at Imperial College London. So today we're going to be talking about sedimentary geochemistry. So sedimentary geochemistry is a really, really incredible resource because it linked to a whole bunch of different earth processes. So fundamentally, it's a product of igneous processes in that they are the weathering products of igneous rocks. It's a product of weathering and erosion in that we generate our sediments by denuding the continents and transporting them around. And then it's also modified by a whole bunch of other processes, such as hydrodynamic sorting, and then weathering with acidic water, and then other processes such as cation exchange. So all this is very helpful in that sediments can tell us a huge amount about a range of different earth processes. The problem, the challenge as I see it, is that because so many different processes go into setting the composition of a sediment, it's really complicated as well. In that, if we want to know about igneous variations, we also have to try and undo the effects of sorting, weathering, erosion, and that's difficult. So how on earth do we go from just a sedimentary geochemical composition, so just weight percent silicon, aluminium, magnesium, to extract meaningful information about the Earth's surface? And that main problem is what I'm going to be talking about today, how we get information about these sort of surface processes from geochemical data. So this is not just some academically interesting question. There are serious outstanding questions about Earth's surface that only sediments can answer for us. So one which I'm really interested in is the composition of the earliest continents. So what makes Earth as a planet really unique is plate tectonics. And as a result, it's very important for us to understand where and when that commenced on Earth. And the composition of the continents is a strong constraint on that. So if we have a felsic continent going back a long time, that would suggest plate tectonics has also been fairly long-lived. Surprisingly, given the importance of this question, it is very much a matter of debate, the composition of the earliest continents. So some people have proposed a very ultramafic and felsic transition, so very ancient mafic continents. Others have confirmed this with a more mafic continental crust, but more recently, this has been challenged with certain isotopic evidence in the sedimentary record suggesting a felsic crust and therefore an ancient onset for plate tectonics. So there really is quite an impassioned debate in the community about the composition of the earliest continents, which is sort of limiting our ability to understand when plate tectonics began. So I believe that we need new and better ways to analyze the sedimentary geochemical record if we're going to resolve some of these difficulties. So today, I'm going to structure my presentation in 4 separate parts. So firstly, I'm going to present a new method which I've developed, which allows us to extract information from the major element composition of sediments. Next, I'll apply this method to a large compilation of sedimentary geochemical data produced by a collaborative research project. Next, I'll discuss how we can use this data and my method to comment on the evolution of the Earth's continental crust through time. And finally, we're going to look at the modern day composition of the continental crust and see how this can inform us about how continents form and evolve. It's tricky. Apologies. So what do we do? What's the first step? So before we want to, if we want to work out what sets the composition of sediments in general, we need to start with having a good understanding of what a sedimentary composition really looks like. So the first thing to do is simply to compile a whole bunch of sedimentary rock geochemical compositions. So at the start of my PhD, I delved into the literature and I compiled around 3,000 sedimentary rock major element compositions. So that's these 7 major element oxides from all across Earth's history, going back from the Archean to the present day, including some modern day sediments as well. So we compile these 3,000 compositions of 7 elements, but the problem is that's quite difficult to interpret. So 7 dimensions is pretty challenging to understand just intuitively. So to try and summarize that, we use principal component analysis. So I'm sure many of you are well aware of principal component analysis, but I've just incorporated this very simple explainer just here to summarize what it is. So PCA, as it's commonly known, is a pretty commonly used technique to summarize multivariate data. So if you take this 2D example of just 2 variables, they're plotted in like an ellipse, a data ellipse. So the original variables are helpful, but there's clearly some redundancy because they're so strongly correlated. So what PCA does is it identifies the directions of maximum variance, in this case, sort of parallel to 1-to-1 and then perpendicular to that. And these principal components summarize the data set and allows you to interpret it in a bit more of an easy manner. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply PCA to our big compilation of sedimentary rock geochemistry to see if we can summarize what's going on and better understand that complexity we've previously discussed. So we utilize a centered log ratio transformation as a standard for compositional data analysis. And once we perform principal component analysis, we can find that if we extract the first 3 components, so a 3-dimensional space, we retain the vast majority of the data of the variance, and we don't lose too much information. So we're pretty happy that we can describe sedimentary geochemical data just in terms of 3 dimensions. And that's what these figures show here. So 3D is obviously a normal XYZ space. So we visualize it on a 3D scatter plot. So these just represent different views of the same data. So it's the same 3D space, and we're just looking at it from different angles. So just to highlight some features, so the gray points in the cloud, that's our sedimentary geochemical data. So that's what we're really interested in. That's our actual data. The black arrows with the elements on, those represent the directions in this PCA space of different elements. So you can see that if we look at this view here, going from left to right, we increase the amount of calcium and sodium in our data set. So that's sort of what, and these arrows are relatively intuitive. The pink and the green represent sort of calibration data sets where we think we can constrain one process. So the pink data are soil compositions going from pristine at the bottom of the soil profile right to very, very weathered soil at the top of a soil profile. So going from here to here sort of represents weathering. And the green represents the process of igneous evolution. So we've sampled, here we've just taken a suite of igneous rocks, which go from basalt to rhyolite. And as a result, this trend, we think, represents the compositional evolution from mafic to felsic. And the black square, this we're going to use as a reference point, and this is the average composition of the upper continental crust as determined by surface averaging. Okay, so now that we've summarized this data, what observations and inferences can we make from it? Well, firstly, the weathering and provenance trends in this transformed space are linear. They form a very nice linear array. So for example, here, we can go from mafic, so enriched in iron and magnesium, to felsic, enriched in potassium, along a straight line in the 3D space. Similarly, weathering also appears to be plot a linear trend. So these points, these weathering profile points from the soil appear to also plot an approximately linear trend. And these trends span the entire range of sedimentary rocks. So we can see that these igneous trends sort of span from up here down to here, which is the same range as sediments. And the same can be said of weathering. So the most weathered soil profile corresponds just a little bit less weathered than the most extremely weathered sediment samples. Secondly, soils, and so the soils are the blue samples, I forgot to mention, I apologize. The sediments and the soils, they lie offset from the igneous rock trend. So here we've got these igneous rocks, and then all of the other samples lie to the left in this view of this trend. And that's parallel to the direction of weathering. So you can see that all of these samples appear to be more weathered than this igneous rock array. And that corresponds to a decrease in calcium and sodium, which is consistent with just how we'd understand weathering in general, which is encouraging. A third observation is that sediments also appear to be distributed along the trend of igneous variation. So here we're just looking along that weathering trend, and we can see that this igneous rock trend goes from mafic, so enriched in iron and magnesium, to enriched in potassium, silicon, aluminium, going from mafic to felsic. And the sediments also show some distribution parallel to this line. And then a final observation, which I may discuss in a bit more detail if I get time, is that if you just fit a plane through the weathering trend and the igneous rock trend, so this blue polygon is a 2D plane fitted, a 2D surface fitted through the data, the soils lie pretty close to this plane, but sedimentary rocks deviate away from it a bit more. So this isn't a particularly important observation, but I may discuss it in a bit more detail later. So based on these observations, I think we can derive a relatively intuitive model for how a sediment gets its geochemical composition. So what we're going to do is we're going to consider a sedimentary geochemical composition X prime. So in this sort of 3D space, it just lies in this space somewhere. And what we're going to do is we want to describe how that composition is different relative to the upper continental crust. So here we have our sediment composition X prime. Now, as I said, we're going to use the upper continental crust as just a reference point. So this is just the average geochemical composition of the upper continental crust in this space. So to get from here to here, we need to move a little bit along this provenance, this igneous evolution vector. So that we're going to call that psi, some motion parallel to this provenance vector. And then we also need to weather that sample along the weathering vector. So omega here is how far we travel along the weathering vector here. And then this produces some fitted composition, which may be a little bit deviating from the real composition. So we need to consider some misfit as well. And this we're just going to term the residuals, or E for error. So what this means is we can describe our composition in terms of motion parallel to an igneous evolution vector, and motion parallel to a weathering vector, and some misfit as well. And then we calibrate these compositional trends using the soil profile data and the igneous rock data I mentioned previously. So what does that all mean? Why is that a useful thing to do? Well, the result is we can now describe a sedimentary composition purely in terms of those two interesting components, i.e. Igneous evolution, so the composition of their protolith, how mafic and how felsic it is, and then how intensely it's been weathered. So this 2D cross plot here is simply the protolith coefficient, psi, plotted against the weathering coefficient, omega, for all of the samples, sedimentary geochemical samples in our data set. And the origin here, by definition, is the upper continental crust. So you can see here that motion from left to right is increasing weathering intensity, which corresponds to a decrease in calcium concentration as displayed by this blue contour. And motion from bottom to top is going from mafic to felsic. And we can see that by the silicon contours, which increase going vertically. And as expected, igneous rocks plot a vertical array because they are simply changing their igneous evolution and are not being weathered, whereas sediment soils plot as going from left to right, i.e. no change in their protolith, but simply increasing their weathering intensity. So simply put, we can turn any major element composition of a sediment into a 2D, a set of 2D coordinates which describe how intensely it's been weathered and then the relative composition of its protolith. Does this work? A very useful, a very important property of models is, does it fit the data? And here we just have the observed weight percent composition of every sediment in our little compilation, and then the fitted composition of that data in our model. And as you can see, it lies pretty perfectly along a 1-to-1 plot, which suggests we're recreating the data quite well and we're extracting the most significant signals. So what this means is a simple 2D linear model is successful in explaining most of the variability in the major element composition of sediments, and very helpfully for us, it has analytical solutions. So we can calculate these coefficients pretty much instantaneously using a few lines of code, which is good news. And as I say, we only consider provenance and weathering, and this does a pretty good job. However, just before I continue on, it is worth saying that not all processes are explained by this model. So if we look at the residuals, so this is this E term here, so the variations don't explain using just protolith and weathering, we might have an idea of what else is explaining the variance in our data set. So if we just look at the residual calcium and the residual sodium, so the excess sodium and the excess calcium, when we take away the fitted and true data, we can see that there's quite a strong negative correlation between them. And what we see is when a sample is enriched in excess calcium, it is generally depleted in sodium relative to our model prediction. And this is pretty consistent with a cation exchange. So interaction of surfaces of clay particles with the dissolved load in water. And helpfully, we have another independent constraint to test this idea, in that we can split our data set into river sediments and then sedimentary rocks. And river sediments, obviously, if they don't go into seawater, they won't have much interaction with sodium. As a result, we would expect them not to be enriched in sodium if they haven't interacted with marine water, whereas sedimentary rocks, which might have been deposited in the sea, they should interact with seawater, and therefore would expect them to see an enrichment in sodium. And as expected, these river sediments generally only have this excess calcium, whereas sedimentary rocks show excess calcium as well as excess sodium. So what this tells us is that protolith and weathering are the dominant controls, but a secondary factor we might want to consider is cation exchange. Okay, so just before I go on further, just to say that this model, which we developed, is you can find out some more details about how we fit it, some further tests to make sure it's working correctly in this article here. So it's published in G-Cubed last year. And yeah, it's all of the details are in there if you want to find out anything more. And the code as well to reproduce this analysis is also available online, details in the manuscript, or you can just ask me afterwards or email me. Okay, so we started this talk talking about how we might want to use a sedimentary record to understand how geological processes have evolved through time. So if we have our model, which extracts helpful information from geochemical data, what we need is a large amount of geochemical data to extract the information from. In particular, we need sedimentary geochemical data that also has a well-constrained age attached to it. So we know when that sediment was formed, and therefore we can date some of these processes. So what we did is we teamed up with the Sedimentary Geochemistry and Paleo Environment project, which some of you may be aware of. It's a collaborative research consortium, nominally run out of Stanford, but it's by Eric Sperling. But it's really a collaborative project within the sedimentary and paleontological community, where everyone is bringing their data together to share it and make it freely available, so that we have this one-stop shop for sedimentary geochemical data. The data was recently published online, so anyone can get access to it. There's around 8,600 samples with in total around 2.8 million analytical data points themselves. So it's a huge data set and it's completely free to access. So I really strongly encourage you to get involved as well. It's been a really positive experience for me, and the collaborative nature of the project makes it really positive. So if you're not already involved and you have some geochemical data which you want to share, get involved, share the data, and it's a really great experience. So we use their data set, and I feel very obligated to share them because it's a really positive experience. Okay, so we have this compilation of sedimentary geochemical data, and what we want to look at is how the composition of the continental crust might have evolved through time. So if we look at our model here, so we've got our sediment composition, upper continental crust, protolith composition, and weathering. We're going to be interested in this term here. So the composition of the protolith for sedimentary rocks back in time. So on the left, what I've done is I've plotted the composition of the protolith, represented by the psi term, through time for all of the data points in the big sedimentary geochemical and paleo environment project data set. So there's around 15,000 samples displayed here as little gray points. And the black circles are the average for every 500-year interval, and these represent 1 sigma. And note, I've grayed out these means just because the number of samples in the very ancient Earth is quite small, so I don't particularly trust the individual samples here. But the average trend for the more robust data is that we can see the most ancient samples on the left appear to have a slightly more mafic crust, more mafic protolith than more recent samples. So you can see that around 2.5 to 3, we had a negative psi, so more mafic than the present day continental crust, and that became more felsic. And then by around 2.0 billion years ago, that became relatively constant. So we can see a qualitative trend of more mafic back in past. But full disclosure, this is a fairly commonly observed an effect. We can see it's more mafic in the past, more felsic now. What's really special about our method is that we can actually extract the full composition of protolith back in time. So how can we use our model to extract the composition of the rocks they came from, so the igneous composition? Well, firstly, let's just consider the composition of the sediment. So it's got a psi value of about -1, so it's a bit mafic, and it's fairly intensely weathered. It's over here. Because we know the trend of weathering, we've calibrated the compositional trend, we can undo the effect of weathering by simply tracking a sediment back to this igneous rock array here. So if this was the original sediment, we can calculate the protolith by just backing it along this weathering trend. So sediment, protolith, unweathering. So what this means is we can actually undo the compositional effect of weathering to reveal the composition of protoliths. So here, displayed on a task plot are the protoliths which we've calculated for the composition, the average protolith for sediments in our data set going back in time. So the circles correspond to different ages. So dark blue is 2.5 billion years and older, and the red is the Phanerozoic, and the black cross here is the estimate of the UCC as averaged by surface sampling. So as you can see, this recreates the observation we saw previously of a slightly more mafic crust than the present day one. So older crust over here is a little bit more mafic. It's lower in silicon and lower in sodium and potassium than the present day crust. But notably, this crust is still really, really high in silica relative to other igneous rocks. So for example, relative to a basalt, we've got about maybe 17% more silica in our reconstructed Archean protolith or composition crust than a basalt. So these, you have these ideas of the Archean continental crust being a field of basalt, like a Hawaiian lava field, but that's not recreated in our data at all. Our compilation of sediment geochemistry seems to indicate that the composition of the Archean continental crust was not that different to the modern day crust. It's high in silica, it's a dacite, it's a very evolved igneous rock. Oh, and these represent 1 sigma uncertainties. So you can see that there is some error in this, but again, nowhere near enough to give you a mafic igneous rock. So the Archean upper continental crust, as represented by sediment protoliths, was a dacite. It's evolved. Not only was it evolved, it was quite heterogeneous. So each little grey sample on this figure again represents the calculated composition of a sediment protolith. So that's basically each of these points represents the average composition of a little Archean catchment. So this means that there's actually quite a lot of lithological diversity, even in the Archean. So you can see that whilst on average it was slightly more mafic, we've got very felsic rocks and very, very mafic rocks, even 2.5 billion years ago. So if we just take all of the data in this sort of blue colored section and all of the data in this red section and compare them directly, this does demonstrate this quite neatly. You can see that the central tendencies, the medians in these box plots, are different, but they overlap considerably. So the range of sediment protolith is basically the same in the Archean as it is in the last 500 million years. So yes, the Archean crust was slightly more mafic, not that much more mafic, but it was also very heterogeneous, pretty much as heterogeneous at the present day continental crust. So there's this idea, as I said, about the Archean crust being fields of basalt, but that doesn't agree with the data which we present here of evolved and heterogeneous continental crust in the Archean. So how does this help us inform geodynamics in the early Earth? So a first off observation is that we have a high silicon continental crust in the Archean. Now, how do we generate felsic rocks at the present day? Plate tectonics. So one interpretation of our data is that felsic rocks in the Archean means that plate tectonics have been ongoing for a long period of time, because we need that plate tectonics to generate felsic data, to generate felsic igneous rocks. As well, the heterogeneity, a constant heterogeneity through Earth history in a very uniformitarian interpretation suggests constant petrogenetic processes. And what's a consistent petrogenetic process? Plate tectonics. So one interpretation of our data is that we've had constant plate tectonics since the very early Earth. However, there are some other important trends to investigate. So just flashing back to here quickly, we can see that there's a change in composition, admittedly a relatively small one, at around 2.5 billion years ago. There's some shift happening in the continents. And this is interesting because this is exactly around the same time we see shifts in a whole bunch of other geochemical proxies. So here, this is data from Binderman et al. 2018 in Science. this is the triple isotope composition of oxygen in shales. So again, another residual weathering product. And this also showed a shift around 2.5 billion years ago. So something's going on about the continent in the continents 2.5 billion years ago. And they argued that it's the onset of the hydrological cycle with the emergence of continents above sea level. Another data set again, this is the relative age distribution of zircons. So it's a little complicated, but this is from Jesse Ramink's new paper. Basically, the dark blue represents recycled zircons. The darker the color is a more recycled proportion of zircons in a given zircon age population. And again, around 2.5 billion years ago, we see the emergence of recycling in the sedimentary record. So we have the three independent geochemical sedimentary proxies, both showing a shift at around 2.5 billion years ago, which is interesting. Right now, I don't have a coherent answer for what this is, but there's clearly some shift going on in geodynamics, be it at the onset of modern plate tectonics, the emergence of the continents, or something similar. Something's going on around 2.5 billion years ago. Okay, so we're going to change tack a little slightly now, and we're going to talk about chemical weathering. So if the onset and the creation of plate tectonics is sort of an igneous process, how they get altered by interaction with the hydrosphere is more a climatic process. So, as I'm sure you'll be aware, the chemical weathering of silicate rocks on the continents transports dissolved cations and dissolved CO2 into the oceans, where it is deposited as calcium carbonate, and as a result, weathering is thought to act as the long-term carbon sink in the carbon cycle. As a result, how this evolves through time is a pretty key data constraint on how the climate has evolved on million-year timescales. So this is a Bob Berner paper from 1999, but the original proposal was in the 80s by Walker et al. That chemical weathering and the climate operate in a feedback loop. So what's the problem? Well, unfortunately, this is a notoriously difficult relationship to identify because there is currently no real long-term record of chemical weathering. So we have some records, admittedly, from the Cenozoic, so Misra et al.'s lithium isotope curve, and there have been some shorter trends across part of the certain deglaciations, for example, by Philip Pogge van Strandman, but we don't really have a long-term record of chemical weathering over the Phanerozoic as of yet. But we might be able to propose such a thing. So if you recall, our model for how a sediment composition is set, we have a weathering term here. So if we can extract the weathering intensity from all of the sediments in our compilation, we might be able to extract some global information about the intensity of weathering on the continents. So admittedly, each individual sediment will give you information of the weathering intensity in their catchment, which is just local information. However, because we have a very large compilation of data from different parts of the Earth, of the surface, and different ages, on average, in aggregate, the average intensity may reflect the global average weathering intensity on the continents. So here we have a time series going from the present day on the right to all the way back to the Ediacaran of the data from the Sedimentary Geochemistry and Paleo Environment Project compilation I previously mentioned. And what we've done is we've calculated the weathering intensity, the omega coefficient for all of these samples, and plotted it up here. So up here on the top would be high weathering intensity, on the bottom would be low weathering intensity. And this dark black line is simply the Gaussian a Gaussian smoother of this very noisy data. And you can see that this shows coherent signals. We can see that it's not simply static through the Phanerozoic. We show significant variations on tens of million year timescales. And the gray arrows here represent like a bootstrapped uncertainty. So this is an estimate of the uncertainty in our data for this smoothing. So what does this tell us about weathering and climate? Well, notably, we see dips in weathering intensity, so lower weathering intensity, during periods of cooler climate, glaciations. So here in the end Ordovician glaciation, we have a low weathering intensity. Cambrian, Carboniferous Permian glaciation here, we also have a low in weather intensity. And then this most significant dip, the lowest weather intensity, is at the present day in the Paleogene Neogene, which coincides with the most recent glacial period. So this would suggest low weather intensity during periods of glaciation. And we could do a second observation here. So I fully admit the oxygen isotope composition of carbonates is a controversial record, which is why we've also compared it to glaciations, which is a bit more reliable. However, it's worth noting that the oxygen isotope composition of carbonates, which is broadly considered to be a proxy for climate, shows a similar trend to our weathering intensity one. So we have peaks in oxygen isotope composition corresponding to warm periods during these periods of elevated weather intensity in the Triassic, the Cretaceous, and the Cambrian as well. So this appears to indicate some sort of link between climate and weather intensity. And again, of interest is that during the expansion of land plants, we also see this gradual increase in weather intensity, which I'm happy to answer some more questions on, but unfortunately I'm not going to cover in too much detail today. So what would we expect to see if there was a silicate carbonate weathering feedback? So this hypothesized link between weathering and climate, what would we expect to see? So let's consider just one example, an increase in mantle outgassing. So we've got increased volcanism, which releases CO2. This would generate, by elevating CO2 in the atmosphere, would get warmer, wetter conditions, which is broadly consistent with greater weathering intensity. So wetter, warmer climate, you're going to be dissolving silicate minerals at a bit more of a greater rate. So weathering being a sink for CO2, would draw down CO2, matching the flux, the increased outflux with an increased sink, which balances the carbon cycle. So what this means is we'd expect to see a link between the silicate weathering intensity and the climate state. So we'd expect to see greater weathering intensity with warmer, wetter climates and a lower weather intensity during periods of cooler climates. And that's basically what we observed. So we see lower intensity, so this low black line coincides with heavy oxygen isotopes and glaciations. So we've got low weather intensity, cool climate, glaciers. That's pretty consistent with the observations we'd expect to see if the silicate carbonate weathering feedback is in operation. So this is really exciting because this is really the first explicit record of weather intensity of the Phanerozoic as extracted, and this is extracted from shales, not carbonates. And this appears to tentatively show some link between climate and weathering consistent with the hypothesized weathering feedback. Now, I would really love to see a further constraint on this. So I think this is a really great data set, but I think what would be really interesting would be to see this to be confirmed with another independent proxy. So for example, lithium isotopes or some other weathering proxy are stored in carbonates. But for now, this is exciting because it appears to indicate a link between climate and weathering intensity as you would expect with the silicate carbonate feedback. And again, just plugging the paper, these results about weathering intensity and the composition of the Archean crust were published just last week in Geochemical Perspective Letters. And this was a really great experience because it was a collaborative writing project with all of the team members of the Sedimentary and Geochemistry Paleoenvironments team. So it was a very collaborative process, a huge number of co-authors, and you can get this completely diamond open access, and it's just short, like a 3,000 word thing. So yeah, if you have any other questions, I refer you to the paper or ask me some questions after I finished up. So finally, the final thing I want to talk about is how we can use this method which I developed to investigate the alteration of the modern day continental crust. So the way we extract the composition of the modern day crust is we simply go out, gather a whole bunch of rocks exposed on the Earth's surface and average their geochemical composition. And this is a very well done thing now. It's sort of been done since Goldschmidt in the 1920s started doing it. And the most recent and sort of well-respected, in a way, record of crustal composition is the one which we use by Rudnick and Gao, 2003. And this is the largest compilation of surface exposed rocks. And this average composition is what we use as our reference point, and obviously, as a result, lies at 0, 0. But the keen-eyed amongst you may notice that this is not on the igneous rock array. So these green samples represent igneous rocks, but the composition of the upper continental crust is not on that line. It's offset. In fact, it is offset by parallel to the weathering intensity trend. So could this be an indication that the upper continental crust is altered by weathering? Or maybe it's just an artifact because this is just from one simple igneous rock array. So to test this, we went out and we compiled some more igneous rocks. So here we used the NAVDAT, North American Volcanic Database, compilation of igneous geochemical compositions, and we calculated their weathering and psi coefficients. And as expected, they lie on a vertical line, as we would hope, but they still lie offset from UCC, which is this black cross here. So igneous rocks, UCC. And this is a pretty consistent trend. Now, there are some very esoteric igneous rocks which don't lie on that trend, and those are lamproites, which are, again, I have some very interesting thoughts about why they might be weathered. But in general, the vast majority of igneous rocks lie offset from upper continental crust, which confirms that observation we made about the UCC being weathered. Yes, just highlighted again here. So this suggests that UCC, the upper continental crust, is a weathered igneous rock. It's not a primary igneous rock. It's simply a rock that's been weathered. We can consider it to be a weathered igneous rock. And that is consistent with a couple other papers. So Lee et al. 2008 and Liu and Rudnick in 2011, they use isotopic proxies to look at weathering and the upper continental crust. And they also find that it looks to be altered. But we're the first to demonstrate that you can demonstrate this using the major element composition alone, which is quite exciting. And we can do one better. So because our method allows us to calculate the protolith of a rock, because we can unweather samples and we can recreate protolith compositions, if we have the present day composition of the upper continental crust and what we think to be the protolith, we can work out how much mass has been lost during weathering. Because if we assume that aluminium is constant, or some other immobile element is constant during weathering, we can calculate how much mass has been lost during the chemical weathering of the crusts. So, for example, using this method, we calculate that this large amount of magnesium had been lost from the continental crust by chemical weathering relative to an igneous rock. And now we might want to compare this to modern day weathering fluxes. So we can just go out into large rivers, measure the magnesium concentration, and calculate how much magnesium is currently being stripped off the continents every year by chemical weathering. And that is around 7.3 times 10 to the 10 kilograms per year. So if this is how much the continents have been weathering at the present day rate, let's just assume for now that that's been going on over the entire history of the Earth, broadly more or less the same. Well, okay, 7.3 times 10 to the 10 kilograms per year. How long does it take at this rate to weather all of the magnesium which we think we've lost? Well, only 150 million years. And that's a problem because the age of the crust, the average age of the continent is around 1.8 billion years old. So what that means is the continental crust is weathered, but it's actually not as weathered as you think, given its age. So if it had been just weathered for 1.8 billion years, we'd expect it to have lost a huge amount more magnesium given modern day weathering rates. So how can we resolve this discrepancy? Well, the answer is that if we're losing some of that sedimentary product from the crust, so if we weather the continents, we weather the igneous continents, and we transport the sediment and the dissolved load together, then that doesn't cause any change in the continental composition at all. So if we need to resolve this discrepancy, we need to be basically stashing away weathering products away from the continents themselves. And the one answer might be as sediments in the ocean basin, but if we calculate how much we'd expect to see, it's nowhere near enough from what we observe. So as a result, the only possible answer is that it's being subducted into the mantle. So doing the sums, we ended up calculating that the crust to mantle recycling rate is around 1.3 times 10 to the 13 kilograms per year. So all of this is just from the major element composition of the upper continental crust. And we've managed to put a constraint on how much sediment has been subducted into the mantle, which we think is quite exciting. So just, before I finish, I really want to thank my supervisors. So Gareth Roberts and Ollie Shortall, my primary supervisors at Cambridge and Imperial, and Eric Sperling at Stanford, who really masterminded the Sedimentary Geochemistry and Paleoenvironment project. And I especially want to thank all of the team members from this collaborative project who contributed their data and helped us work out this, what I think are some really neat research problems. So just to summarize, I'll put up my principal conclusions. So I presented today a model which deconvolves the weathering and provenance signals from a sediment major element composition. We use this to show that the Archean continental crust is evolved and varied in its composition. And we also use this to produce a weathering trend across the entire Phanerozoic, which we think confirms the long hypothesized relationship between climate and weathering rates. And finally, we demonstrated how the modern day continental crust is a weathered igneous rock, not a primary igneous material. And yeah, as I say, a whole bunch of these observations have been published now. So if you are interested, I strongly encourage you to read our papers. Elsewise, you can email me or follow me on Twitter or tweet me, or you can just ask me a question now. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. And I think we've got plenty of time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. And now let's go ahead. So Tianmo from University of Bern, Switzerland, please.
Hi, can you see or hear me?
Yep, I can see and hear you.
Great. So this is Tian from University of Bern in Switzerland. I actually have some interaction with Ollie Shortall when I was at Oxford, so it's a small circle. And back to the science, I have a question regarding the method about the linear algebra. Could you both go back to your earlier slides?
Yes.
Where you start talking about the principal component analysis when you start.
Okay. Yeah, is there anything you wanted to have a look at in particular?
Yeah, a bit. Yeah, we can use this. It doesn't matter. So basically, when you do a principal component analysis, you have like a 30,000 sample data, which has 7 components of oxides, right? When you do the analysis, I would guess it's a large matrix if you do the PCA. And that matrix, if you do the so-called SVD, singular value decomposition, then you get the principal component. So in that case, the number of components would not be only 3, it will be many and perhaps larger than 7. How do you choose the principal component? And what's the reason behind that?
Yeah, so you're right. So we do get more principal components than the 3 I've displayed here. So the number of principal components you get is equivalent to the number of dimensions of your data, because obviously in reality, you can't lose a dimension. So we put in 7D, so we have to get 7D out. That's sort of, so there is another, ideally, yeah. However, because what PCA does is it ranks these directions in terms of the variance explained. So the first component explains the most variance, and then subsequent directions will have less variance on. So
I see.
And this figure here shows the amount of variance explained on each principal component, depending on the number of ones we choose. So as you'd expect, if we choose all 7, we explain all of the variance, but obviously at that point, we haven't done anything because we've kept the same number of dimensions. So the goal is to choose a number of components which explains a large amount of variance without losing too much. So what you normally do is you pick it where it starts beginning to shallow out on this. It's called a scree plot. So if we pick this value here, we do lose around 15% of the variance, but we gain the benefit that we've got a much more manageable data set to work with. So you're right that we do lose some information, but we've judged that there's not too much information lost that we do lose anything. And actually, I have looked manually at these components, and it's, firstly, it's small in magnitude, and there doesn't appear to be too much significant structure. So we're convinced that this three-dimensional reduction is meaningful. And also, actually, we only use the PCA just to look at our data. We're just using this for the visualization. When we do the actual modeling, this is 7-dimension. We just visualize it in 3D. So we're not, in this modeling approach, we don't lose any data via the PCA method. The PCA is just a way of looking at our data. So it's not actually a way of, we're not actually getting rid of any information in the modeling itself. The PCA is purely for visualization.
Well, you actually answered my next question already. But either way, so what I want to ask. So the key thing is about the major component, and that major component is based on major oxides.
Yep.
And that is why all your information is based on that. And when your result contradicts with others that is based on isotope values, then I would guess it's hard to say, right? Because your model doesn't consider isotope values.
Yeah.
If it did, then it works.
It's
right?
That's a really good question. So the reason we chose major elements is sort of just because lots of data, and it is most of a rock. So 99% of your rock is your major elements. So it just seemed like a good place to start. Your second question is really interesting, and this model, as you said, cannot answer that question because it is fundamentally major elements alone.
I mean, mathematically, it's translational, right? Why don't it construct a separate model for the isotopic system and look at the results?
I am doing exactly that. So hopefully I'll be able to have something for you. So not just isotopes, but other trace elements. So a very analogous approach you could apply to rare earth elements, because they are a suite of 14 elements, but we know as a community that they generally only behave, they can be simplified quite a lot. So, you have these sort of high rare earth, low rare earths. So that suggests you can reduce it using a method a bit like PCA. So I think it's interesting that, I think you're right that it's interesting the majors and traces don't behave. They don't seem to agree with each other. The best person who has thought about this is Brennan Keller at Dartmouth. So he had a paper out last year basically arguing that major elements are probably more reliable than trace elements because the changing mantle potential temperature over the Archean means that the interaction between trace elements and igneous evolution has evolved quite a lot. So basically, what strontium means as a trace element is different in the Archean than it does at the present day, whereas major elements have behaved, broadly speaking, the same, which means that the reason major elements and trace elements might disagree is because the trace elements have changed their behavior due to changing mantle potential temperature, whereas major elements are broadly the same. I probably simplified the argument quite a lot, but I think if you just look at Brennan Keller's publications, it's from 2020, and I think it's a PNAS paper. So it's a good read, and I agree. It's a really interesting question. I don't know why these things shouldn't agree, because they really should. But
Thank you. That's a great direction. I will check out the reference. I have another minor question. So when you extract 3 major principal components, like component 1, 2, 3, what exactly are they? They should have a combination of those oxides.
Yes, here we go. So these are just, this isn't perfectly a representation because they're at an angle, but so principal component 2, you can see to be broadly calcium versus sodium. Principal component 1 is calcium and sodium versus everything else. So principal component 1 appears to be sub-parallel to weathering. Principal component 3 appears to be sub-parallel to the provenance trend. So potassium, sodium, silicon, aluminium versus iron and magnesium. So the principal component 3 is parallel-ish to provenance. Component 1 is parallel-ish to weathering.
My question is basically when you do the PCA, then your result will have a singular value decomposition, which will give you a series of vectors, which corresponds to the series of principal components. And each vector is basically have 7 components. It's about the amount of calcium, potassium, right? So you can extract those coefficients. Then that might give an average oxide component composition for each component.
Yes.
Just curious about the exact. And anyway, I think it's not on the slides, but.
So yeah, we do, it's in the papers. So if you are interested, it is in the date that we do release the full component breakdown in the manuscript. But basically, initially what we did is we did PCA, and then we just took these scores to be our weathering and provenance data. But we found that because the vectors didn't quite parallel our calibration data sets, we thought that was a bit whiffy. So we decided to actually just go ahead and define our own vectors. So that's when we moved from using PCA just to a visualization tool, basically.
I see. Thank you. I took too much time. I'm sorry. I think others have questions. I'll mute myself. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Actually, as was mentioned earlier, for Brendan Colors, he also gave a talk in our webinar last year. I think the video link still exists in the Google Sheet. So I think for Tianmeng, if you would like interested to check out Brendan Keller's talk, you are free to watch the YouTube video. So next question is from Xingu, and the question is, how does the reverse weathering of the sediments impact your model and the interpretation?
So I don't know, maybe I'm not sure I quite understand what you mean, but the way the reverse weathering, fine, I understand. Okay, sorry. Reverse weathering as in interaction with silicate products in the subsurface in marine realm. Okay, so yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, we had a very big discussion about this with the reviewers for our second paper. We actually think we're sort of robust against the effects of that because, largely speaking, sediments will behave largely in a closed system in the subsurface. So whilst certainly reactions do occur, as long as there isn't a huge efflux of dissolved components out of dissolved silicate minerals out of the sediment column, then the major element sediment composition should be fairly the same. There are some instances when there is a large interaction between the sediment and water column, but that's largely for orthogenic components like carbonate. So if we consider carbonate to be an additional diagenetic process, that does affect our model a bit in that it biases us to be low weathering intensity. So we actually did do a screening procedure for our Phanerozoic weathering trend. We actually did screen out examples which deviate quite strongly. So one of the benefits of our approach is that we have this residuals. So if we have some composition which isn't well fitted by this model, it'll have a high residual. So we can just screen out samples which have high residuals, so we can get rid of samples which look to have been affected by other processes. So yeah, reverse weathering was something we thought about quite a lot, but we concluded we think we're robust against it because firstly, sediment column is largely mostly a closed system. And because we also average, most of our principal conclusions come from averaging large amounts of sediments. If reverse weathering is a relatively stochastic process, it should sort of counter each other out so that the global trend is the same. And then also we do a screening procedure so we can remove any samples which are particularly egregious. I hope that answers your question. But yeah, no, it's a good question. And yeah, we did get a lot of questions from this from a reviewer as well.
Okay. I have an extra question regarding the weathering.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you showed the result for applying the model to a sample, and then you explain the residue by river weathering. I think you have the slides, which has a rectangular box and
yes, I'll get
negative one. Yeah, this one. Oh, yeah, this one. So on the plot, you show the residue, that is E, right?
Yeah.
In your model, you already have a component of weathering, which is W, the bold type W. I mean, whether a river sediment calcium gain and sodium loss is also a weathering process, right? If it is captured in weathering, why it's not in the W component, but in the E component?
Yes, so it's a good question. So here this is where it kind of breaks down to semantics. So for example, if you talk to the soil science community, they will say that cation exchange is just a type of weathering. The way we set up our model means that it's not, that we consider it not to be the case. So basically, as you say, we consider weathering to be simply just a loss of calcium and sodium together. And we can broadly consider that to be analogous to plagioclase or feldspar breakdown. Here, cation exchange is something different because there's no real mass loss, well, there's a bit of mass loss, but it's an exchange as opposed to mass loss. So that's why we don't consider it to be weathering really. Because what happens is if you deposit like fresh water in the oceans, calcium, which is adsorbed to clay surfaces, it gets kicked out by sodium, and the calcium goes into the ocean. So it's an exchange as opposed to loss, which is why we don't define it as weathering. But what people do define as weathering is that's semantics really. But in our model, it's not weathering, but it is also an interesting process. And it's worth noting that actually some reverse weathering reactions, the stoichiometry is the same as calcium-sodium exchange. So if you're doing, for example, albertization, the net stoichiometry is exactly the same as this trend here. So it's interesting that this appears to be the most significant residual behavior, and it is also a reverse weathering reaction. So we think we sort of have it under control. We know it exists, but in a sort of predictable way.
That's cool. Actually, residue is also containing some information.
Yes, yeah, no, it is helpful. And actually we do, I did simplify it a little just for the talk, but when we calculate our weathering intensity, we do actually consider this trend explicitly. So this is a non-linear trend. It's very slightly non-linear, so we can't solve it analytically, but it's still a very easy numerical solution. It takes like milliseconds.
It's non-linear because it also contains other information from residue, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's weirdly, unintuitively, it's non-linear. So yeah, but it's a residual, but it's helpful information nonetheless.
I see. Great. Thank you.
Okay, I think the last question is that what's the average composition of the whole continental crust compared with that of the upper continental crust evolution with time?
So the composition of the modern day crust relative to the ancient crust.
Ancient ones, yeah, the continental crust, because this one that you mainly mentioned about the upper continental crust. So
right, yeah.
I'll ask about the entire.
I see. Okay.
Crust. Entire continental crust.
Yes. So I have a slightly controversial view in that I don't really believe any estimates for the composition of the total crust, just because they're not particularly well constrained by data. So the good thing about the upper continental crust is that you can get at it. So you can simply go out, gather a whole bunch of samples, and you can measure it, and it's an observable value, and that observable value is this cross. The total composition of the upper continental crust, however, the total composition of the crust, however, is not easy to get at because obviously you need to drill down into the lower crust, which we don't have access to. So I know people have produced estimates of the total composition of the crust, and on average, I think it's an andesite in general. So some of these calculations put it down here. The reason I don't use it is because it's not that I don't believe it, I just think it's not constrained enough by data to really meaningfully compare it to this value, which is very data driven. So I think if it would exist on this plot, it would be here in the andesite trend. And that's because just people sort of hypothesize, not for no reason, but for theoretical reasons, that the lower crust will be basalt. So they just mix the two and ends up down here. So yeah, it's not a particularly satisfying answer, but it would be here. I'm skeptical of that value for the reasons of lack of data.
Okay, great. Okay, it's a very good seminar, and thank you again, Alex, for giving the talk, and thanks everybody for the participation. So next Monday, we're going to have another talk from Zefeng Li, and he's talking about the unsupervised learning, working on the earthquake source characteristics. Okay, with that, thank you again, Alex. And,
Brilliant. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, have a good night, everybody.
See you. Oh, and yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or contact me. Brilliant. Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.